Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Beth Dolan, the Dean of the College of Health at Lehigh University. The mission of the College of Health is to improve health outcomes for populations, communities, and individuals through health and education. We're especially interested in upstream causes of health and illness, and that's where we work the hardest to intervene. This is our very first session in this year's colloquium series. The theme of this year's colloquium series is disability independence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I first want to acknowledge the co-sponsors and collaborators on this series, which include the interdisciplinary programs in the College of Arts and Sciences, the Institute for Health Policy and Politics, and for the first time, an external partner, Good Shepherd Rehabilitation Network. So the College of Health decided to create a strategic research cluster in disability independence. So there's a couple of words there I want to define. The strategic research cluster means that we'll be looking to hire about 20% of our faculty, which would be about 10 to 12 faculty members focused in this area. And then what we mean by disability independence is we aim with a multidisciplinary faculty group to advance the equity, well-being, agency, and community success of people of all ages with disabilities. So in this effort, we're following the International Classification of Functioning Disability in Health, which includes mobility, physical, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, vision, hearing, cognitive, learning, psychological, and invisible disabilities. So together, an interdisciplinary team of College of Health researchers working in collaboration with people with disabilities, very important, our colleagues in the colleges of engineering and education, and external partners like Good Shepherd Rehabilitation will create or apply technology designed to support more independence and thriving. So we're in hiring mode for this initiative, and we've linked the job opportunities in disability independence in the chat. So there are we're hiring 2 people in disability independence in the areas of community health and multiple determinants of health, as well as disability law, policy, and ethics. And then we have a named chair, the Ferlinza chair, in which we're hiring an expert in developing or applying assistive technologies. So yeah, very excited for you all to join us to explore this topic, to learn more about the research that's being done internationally in the space of disability independence. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Eduardo Gomez, who is a professor of health policy and politics in the Department of Community and Population Health in the College of Health. He's also the director of the Institute for Health Policy and Politics. Dr. Gomez will introduce our speaker today, Dr. Anat Caspi, and we really appreciate her time and joining us to share her expertise. Dr. Gomez?
Yes, thank you, Dean Dolan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this wonderful focus on the colloquium series on disability independence. My name is Dr. Ed Gomez, and I'm a professor in the College of Health and Department of Population and Health. And today I'm honored to have as our inaugural speaker, Dr. Anat Caspi, who will be giving a lecture titled, "How Can We Advance Disability Justice in Mobility and Transportation?" Dr. Anat Caspi is director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology. This initiative is housed by the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science at the University of Washington, is focused on translating novel research and technologies for use by populations with disabilities. Dr. Caspi received her PhD in bioengineering from the Joint Program in Bioengineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and UC San Francisco, and her MS and BS in Computer Science from Stanford University. Dr. Caspi's primary research areas are in the fields of ubiquitous computing and contextually aware automation. Her research focuses on engineering machine intelligence solutions for customizable real-time responsive technologies in the context of work, play, and urban street environments. She has designed, developed, and evaluated sensor and mobile applications for personalized navigation in routing pedestrian ways, improving personal automated mobile devices, and enhancing automation in play work environments with contextually responsive behavior. Dr. Caspi is interested in exploring different ways in which collaboration, commons, and cooperation can challenge and transform the current economics of assistive technology and incentivize rapid development and deployment of ethically built, accessible technologies. So with that, I'm happy to pass this over to Dr. Caspi. I will then be monitoring the questions at the end, and we'll announce our next colloquium's discussion on disabilities at the end. So thank you very much, Dr. Caspi.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Gomez. And thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm very honored to be the inaugural speaker and the speaker in general. And as I was listening to your own agenda in advancing health outcomes for people with disabilities, I just felt like, this was really in sync with a lot of the work that we've been doing and promoting and advising in the last couple of years. So I hope you too will see the synergies between my talk today about developing an agenda to advance disability justice in mobility and transportation, and the potentials for adequate, equitable, inclusive health outcomes and cities, and really be able to transform the way we view the future of our cities as it relates to mobility and transportation today. But you can see how some of this hopefully can also be implemented in other areas. So as noted, you gave me a great presentation. I don't need to fully introduce myself, but my name is Anat Caspi. I'm the director of the Taskar Center. The mission of the Taskar Center is to take research outcomes and identify ways to develop them out and translate and deploy them onto different, technologies in the hands of people, and particularly focus on technologies that can enhance independence and quality of life for people with disabilities. And so through that program in the last few years, we've developed both mechanisms for addressing and mapping out the built environment, and then downstream applications from there that can be providing trip planning applications, which I'll demonstrate in a bit, 3D printed maps for people who have vision disabilities, and also planning applications, downstream applications that can inform transportation planners and urban planners in terms of how to create equitable urban plans. And so I begin my talk involving how to create equitable cities by actually looking at the notion of smart cities. And they're often praised for technological advancements. They're supposed to be efficient. And this potentially is a fallacy. And I contend it's an ableist vision of the future, because it envisions something clean, tech-driven, a world where urban issues just vanish and they are exemplified by initiatives that really drive thought processes that rely on place-agnostic big data models. And I call out the Columbus, Ohio's 2016 Smart Cities Challenge win a little bit here, because it was really a way for Alphabet, the Google parent company, to drive this idea of a big data model and how it can provide in a place agnostic kind of way, not really involving community-based ideas and inputs, to shape the way by which transportation and urban plans would be transformed to provide a smart city. And cities are ecosystems, and this kind of planning doesn't really acknowledge the fact that they're not just machines. They need to be inclusive solutions that enhance everyone's quality of life. And the fallacy that we sometimes see in smart city initiatives simplifies that urban complexity and prioritizes technology over citizens' opinions, lived experience, and well-being. And so what do we need to do to kind of counterbalance that and establish a non-ableist paradigm in mobility and transportation to provide a comprehensive agenda that could really encompass multiple elements of what it is that we're talking about. So firstly, the incorporation of participatory design thinking is really key. It involves the active engagement with diverse stakeholders, and of course, that includes disabled individuals. And it requires that kind of engagement to shape the transportation systems that genuinely meet the needs of the community. Secondly, we want to require that data collection and any analysis frameworks would be rooted in those lived experiences. So emphasizing standardization, yes, because we need to have things that are consistently collected, but they have to be nuanced. It has to be data that reflects the realities of travelers' lives and how they travel and really traverse the environment. And it needs to also be coupled with traveler-centered performance metrics to really assess, is this accessible to this individual? Is this inclusive comprehensively? And finally, the third pillar is really to foster a non-ableist vision of this inclusive future that we're ideating on. And specifically, what are the capacity building tools that have to be developed, not only to empower engineers, designers, policymakers, and society to provide, an inclusive engagement in that build out, as well as the way of identifying how well we're doing, but also foster the awareness and the education to accept that inclusive design principle as the paradigm, as something that is different and offers accessibility, equitability, and dignity and mobility and transportation systems overall. So this kind of three-pronged approach ensures that our transportation infrastructure becomes a catalyst for more equitable and inclusive cities centered around the diverse experiences and needs of all individuals who are living in those locations. So the remainder of the talk will be organized along these lines, and we begin with community-based participatory design. So what I'm showing now is a rather messy view of design thinking, and this was one of those cartoon designs that are gathered in large meetings where people get together and discuss what is design thinking and what it means to different people. And me, as an engineer who teaches and is responsible for the upbringing of other engineers, I try to think where to start and what do I teach in order to allow my students to have that kind of more inclusive thinking that we were just talking about. So in all my interactions with students, I really stress that engineers are inherently designers, carrying the weighty responsibility of recognizing unintended exclusions in their designs. So in my courses, I delve into design thinking, as well as the designers themselves, emphasizing that design should never happen in isolation. And it's a reflection of the designer's nuanced understanding and potential biases that we want to reflect upon and potentially detangle from the design process. But however, in conveying the interconnectedness of design and design thinking, a lot of students leave our conversations finding it overwhelming, much like this very cluttered cartoon of a conversation about design thinking. They understand that user-centric approaches are important. They understand that they tend to succeed by mitigating those designer biases through observation and alignment with other users. But it just is a tip of the iceberg, a beginning of a conversation, but doesn't necessarily give them a methodology to follow non-ableist, community-based participatory design principles. And often they leave a little bit more confused potentially than even before. So then we do want to progress and discuss not just user-focused design, but co-design. These participatory design conversations that allow us to create a furtive dialogue, not just a one-time event. And it forces our teams to situate everyone in that conversation and explicitly explore the potential biases that they're bringing. And it also asks team members and especially designers to challenge those assumptions that they make about people and environments, and also ask them, for whom is your design meeting the needs, which is an especially important question when it comes to disability. And in particular, we want to emphasize that when we adopt that time-honored view is that designing for the normative user is the right approach for user-centered design, we're necessarily promoting an ableist outcome. And I'll explain what I mean. So when designers and engineers have in mind the framing that they're designing for what we call the normative user, which means that they think they're covering, 76% of users, by necessity, that is an ableist approach, because by definition, what constitutes of that typical user takes the norm and several standard deviations from the norm too. And that also comes sometimes from a potentially arbitrary sampling of the population. And you define that norm as the ideal. And so that is then called the average user. And even when we follow user-centered design practices, we tend to, and many of the large companies admit to doing this, they are trying to cover the 80% of the population that lies right there. And we never quite question what is outside that norm. Not only if my sample was biased, but even if it wasn't that biased at baseline, to be within this norm is to function as defined as able. And that unfortunately means that disability becomes a label that encompasses human experiences that sit outside of that norm. So people who are defined as having a disability are associated with being at these extreme ends of statistical distributions. And so people with disabilities face a lot of challenges rooted in their position in these distribution tails, like medicalization, pathologization, social perceptions of difference. And so despite the fact that there are significant numbers of people here, individuals with disabilities often find themselves marginalized and underserved. And many of the barriers that we encounter result from designs that primarily cater to those normative users that are found right here in the distribution center. And so this approach, whether intentionally or not, it perpetuates ableism because it accommodates people with disabilities as seen as something different or unique. And it reinforces the notion that disability is an impairment, while non-disabled individuals are considered that norm. And we see in transportation and mobility a lot of manifestations of this, including limited access to affordable transportation for people who lay here, physical obstacles like steps blocking entrances, as well as problematic interpersonal interactions in mobility and transportation. For example, invasive questions in eligibility surveys, or unfounded assumptions about people with disabilities needing assistance. So co-design provides just one way, and specifically community-based participatory design is one way to get around biases by bringing people for whom the design is intended to participate to the conversation. And the objective is to not only widen the range of people that we consider, so opening up these gaps and removing these red lines, but also widening the applicability of the design by taking into consideration more perspectives than just lay here. And in the context of engineer and designers' lives, or my students' lives, co-design requires us to really, at the same time, acknowledge and defamiliarize ourselves with our own experiences. And so then we can reformulate some of those ideas about design and engineering in order to address the fact that really no two humans are the same. And I do want to take just another moment to explore why community-based participatory design is not just ethically right, as I described before, but is also founded in reality and numbers. because while our natural tendency is to say, yes, I'll pursue user-centered design, but it will still be relatively easy for designers to fall into that trap of designing for the average user. On the face of it, it seems like a good idea to design for some average user, but obviously people do vary. And the problem is that although we can measure body dimensions of large groups of people and determine what that average is, it's actually difficult to find individuals who, on the whole, identify as being within those norms for more than just a few of those metrics. So a specific study that really demonstrated this was Bailey 1982, where measuring various physical body dimensions like height, arm length, and chest of only men, and the sample size of 4,063 adult men, only 25.9% were found to be close to average in the first measurement. The experiment continued, and each subsequent measurement where they were trying to narrow down the people who remained within those bars of the norm became significantly harder and harder to find a population that really provided that average person. And essentially what that means is that the concept of that average person in practicality does not exist. And so we should really dispel any notions of designing for that presumed individual. So that's still a nice theory, but what do we equip our students in practice to do? And how do we practice even once we identify like who might be a user base for our co-design? We have to kind of succumb to the ideas that one of our greatest shortcomings in discussing human-centered design is that it doesn't provide guidance on how to include diversity as part of the design process. Like essentially the students are asking which humans exactly belong in the center of the conversation. And although many companies and manufacturers and transportation agencies devote a lot of resources to researching user populations, many products still appear on the market that seem to have not been designed with the intended users in mind. And all of us have experienced or noticed some dangerous, baffling, or like really irritating product designs, which were failures of the design process. And so to give a real sense of this to students, I often bring in John Porter's Wall of Exclusion, which is a pegboard display of an assortment of video controllers that require the use of not just one, but two hands. And John Porter, who was a graduate of ours and now works for Microsoft, says that there's a mismatch, a deep mismatch between what expectations are baked into designs versus what people are able to and wish to physically do. And so as we developed our disability justice, mobility, and transportation agenda, we have coupled the work with toolkits for others to repeat community-based participatory design methodologies and really promote an understanding that unless we explicitly work with design methods that are oriented around designing for variability. So we really are trying to identify where diversity lies and how we can address that holistically. It's somewhat useless to hope that our technologies or our design methods will yield something that's organically accessible or universally applicable. And therefore, translation becomes a real challenge. So what does all of this have to do with access to transportation and mobility, or what are we hoping to find in other institutional settings, right? In the educational setting, we can do a lot of education, we can provide a lot of methodologies, but how do we translate some of this to real world settings where there are real constraints of time and resources, and design pipelines and other kinds of regulatory hurdles that have to be addressed? And so our belief is that we have to move not user-centered practices, but rather community-based participatory design practices from being an afterthought or a checkbox for planners and designers into part of the holistic methodology in order to move the needle on equity and inclusion in city planning. And specifically, the way we've been addressing this is with community advisory groups, trying to change the mechanism by which, for example, Seattle is adopting autonomous vehicles and including the community inputs through the entire design process, which will include the way by which we regulate that kind of adoption in our city. And I'll skip through this just for lack of time, but we were just demonstrating how working with the community impacts the way by which we understand some of the thorny challenges and problems with the current system. So now I'd like to turn to actual technology development work that interlocks with the participatory design process, as opposed to just being downstream from it. And we approach the development of new technology, acknowledging that prior technologies have really made transformative differences in the ability of some people to tackle daily navigational needs. So we're not throwing technology out the door. We're acknowledging that it has actually had a transformative difference in some people's lives, certainly in automobile navigation, certainly somewhat in public transportation, because people have demonstrated that using trip planning applications, using public transit, they are able to reach further and to more locations and diversify their reach by using public transport, and specifically the trip planning technologies coupled with public transit, but definitely not when it comes to pedestrian ways. So when it comes to pedestrian ways, if you ask for a to travel by foot, we tend to get something of what we see here, which is a dotted line. And there's a big disclaimer there that, in fact, there's no certainty that there exists infrastructure to support your trip that's shown here. And indeed, many of you may not be familiar with Seattle, and a lot of my depictions are Seattle-based, so I'll try to be really explicit in what you see. This particular trip planner provides a foot instruction that asks people to cross via a bridge that currently does not have any sidewalk or pedestrian infrastructure, thereby, relegating an individual to just do the guesswork and what happens if they get there and they really can't walk down a bridge which is driven upon just like a highway with 35 to 40 miles per hour traffic. And so with this kind of limited information, we're ill-equipped as pedestrians, all of us, to make safe or smart decisions about our travel. And many of us, though we have come to depend on our smartphones and other apps for navigating the city, what we don't realize is that a lot of these applications don't use information about many modes of travel, not just the pedestrian ways. We're also missing crucial information about transit facilities. We're missing any information about the non-fixed routing system. So any shuttle systems are typically not in these planners, any type of paratransit, and other kinds of subsidized travel. And so in a way, this gives us a very myopic view and fairly autocentric approach to traversability, but we've all been just very poorly trained to just accept that that's what trip planners do. And largely what we challenge at the Taskar Center is that mode of thinking, because sidewalk navigation and non-motorized transportation is essential to vibrant modern cities, and sidewalks make up the fabric of urban life. And every commuter, whether they're walking to her car or arriving home from the bus station or going to a city street for a jog or commuting to my next health appointment, all of that uses sidewalks to connect different modes of commuting. And I argue is really an essential factor to how people can navigate cities independently and increase their reach to all those community services that increase our quality of life. So transportation data equity is really at the heart of what we use as the operative term to drive technology that not only informs people about their travel environments and services, but also can tell us about the accessibility gaps that we have engineered into our environment, and also allow us to develop evaluation frameworks that allow us to track just how well are we doing in improving some of these gaps over time, which is a huge question that we cannot answer right now. So it all starts with personal mobility. Each of us has diverse preferences. We have diverse needs and requirements when we navigate through a city's built environment, and we each mobilize differently. And mobility, unlike transport, is personal. It's a joint expression of our individual likes and abilities to move in real time through real physical spaces within diverse environments. So it's all of those components put together. And I argue that what those pedestrian routing applications and mass-produced apps have done is to remove that personal mobility aspect from the picture, right? Because we just got this very generic view of like, oh, if there's a road there, you can do it. And clearly that doesn't take into account this personal mobility. But, the new US urban agenda is going to move us closer to that because it prioritizes sustainability and equity. And as a result, cities are increasingly incentivized to offer individuals ways to choose non-motorized mobility, to perform all or most of their daily activities. Or in many cases, we end up somewhat penalizing those using their vehicles in order to promote that kind of behavior. And we're told now that a good, smart choice for the for the future city is the non-motorized choice. But we have to grasp how hard it is for us to transform our thinking from where we came. And what the image that I'm showing is a little bit of why it's a huge paradigm shift for city planners in the US to grapple with this new agenda, because really urban planning traditionally has favored private vehicle use, which is what the image is showing. It's a private vehicle with a family inside it, potentially two families, and they are traveling and all happily together in a private vehicle. And that support for non-motorized mobility does depend on accessible amenities that are not shown in this vision of the US city, right? Road network data is very well detailed and standardized, whereas sidewalk and pedestrian infrastructure data has been traditionally fragmented, lacks connectivity, lacks detail, and it's a vital component for us to transform our cities into pedestrian trip planning havens, essentially. And so again, the mass-produced applications are just missing that vision. And transportation planners are grappling with a lot of questions that they have unanswered because of that lack of data infrastructure and the way to use potentially that data, even if it's there. So what can lead us to a smarter city, or one that provides more independence for more travelers? The first is that commuters need to identify how to find safe, accessible routes that are tailored to their abilities. And next are ADA compliant eligibility. Businesses like paratransit, as well as businesses themselves, need to be able to identify how do accessible paths to transit stops actually exist for these commuters, and how do we get around it if they do not. And then finally, for city planners and transportation planners, how to identify prioritization schemes where we are best utilizing our resources to invest in non-motorized infrastructure is still a very open question. And, we've done recent studies to demonstrate that there is a lot of non-rigid fudging factors in how these prioritization schemas are done, but not for the fault of anyone other than the fact that that data is not existent and it's very hard to get at it. And so people end up with lack of support for making those decisions in a truly equitable way. So verging right back to where we started, if we start out from communities of practice and place, and we find that, the previous model doesn't really serve people. In fact, the longitudinal study over the past 8 years indicate that people with disabilities and no disabilities alike find that those pedestrian routers do all of them a disservice. And so how do we transform our thinking, both design thinking and our engineering practices, to enable positive pedestrian experiences for people that give them a sense of place? And only then we can start addressing the underlying obstacles of implementing smart cities, right? So forget that very clean vision of a smart city. Let's simplify the process of undoing some of the harms we've done through identifying what are ways of improving the current system and making that more equitable in order to drive the change that we need into the future. And so our approach has been really to talk to people, understand how those tools are underserving them or not serving them or serving them, harms, and identifying the ways by which we can potentially ameliorate that with technology, but not as a technology solutionism. So our approach has been developed through the Open Sidewalks project. That is a participatory design project that creates consistent standardized data schemas as well as data collection tools about the city to describe the pedestrian environment. And I should actually say, not just cities, we're now in a number of different types of built environments. We've now worked internationally as well in places like Quito, Ecuador, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we're working in rural communities in Washington. So we started out looking at the thorny problems in cities and have really expanded our thinking into all kinds of built environments. So what we try to do is use technology as well as community-based design to understand both computationally and culturally what are the links between mobility and how spaces are built and configured. And so Open Sidewalks promotes this very pedestrian-centric approach to non-motorized mobility and city planning. And it all starts by including those people who are using the urban environment, particularly commuters with diverse mobility profiles, when we learn the travel patterns and give travelers the information they need to make decisions that are smart for them, right? So we aim to make the use of the built environment easier and to maximize a traveler's ability to take delight in non-motorized travel. And that includes various aspects of information. So describing the pedestrian environment has to be a detailed, accurate description, nothing subjective. So when we find a lot of data sets from cities that tell us this sidewalk is accessible, the first question is accessible to whom, and who had been empowered to make that assessment. Because of course, accessibility in the built environment means very different things to different people. And so the detailed observations that are very specific, neutral data points are very important in this aspect. The next is that we want to be able to serve pedestrians with human-centric factors. So we want to understand what are individuals' goals, abilities, and travel purposes, and what needs and preferences impact trip experience. And that too goes into the collection of data that we provide. So while all of this seems fairly intuitive, I will tell you that it is sometimes earth-shattering to many transportation and city agencies to try to wrap their heads around the kind of data collection that we say is necessary and responsive to users' needs. And planners tend to assume that pedestrians can and will use virtually any street, perhaps only excluding highways. And in addition, they modeled all pedestrians as moving the exact same way as one another, with the same abilities, endurance, and strong preferences. And so glossing over that heterogeneity in the population lands us in maps like the one I'm showing here, which is a planning map for a specific transit agency, and it publishes the areas served by a particular bus line. And in this particular case, we're looking at the analysis of a set of related bus lines connecting Seattle to the east side of the city. So this here is the east side, and here is Seattle. And as you may have noticed, is that the areas of service are pretty broad circles depicted around the map. And the service areas are a bunch of like overlapping circles. Some of the circles include large bodies of water, and we ask ourselves, like, why is this? Why is the agency saying that a bus line would serve half of Lake Washington, for example? And largely, again, it's because they're ignoring urban form and ignoring that personalized mobility, the pedestrian mobility. And rather than specifically analyzing how pedestrians can get around in an urban space, they've simply decided on a radius of service and plopped it on the map. And this implies some very silly things like pedestrians swimming to destinations or walking through buildings. And of course, it is highly inaccurate. And, one might say, well, it's an approximation and this is a vision, and this allows them to just, conflate this with some population data so they know what size of a population they're serving. But in fact, it's so reductive that it doesn't really offer a true view, because as we know, a lot of these communities that are so disconnected, actually, because it already lies in fairly rural environments or suburban environments, aren't served by those lines in the same way. And so we have to be really true to ourselves and accountable to what it is that we're depicting to really say that these populations are being served. So not ignoring urban form and personalized mobility is kind of the flaw here. And so now I'm showing 3 different ways of looking at pedestrian access and pedestrian walkability. And in the first, on the left, is still that depiction of what we call as the crow flies radial reach, which we just talked about. In the middle, we're showing a slightly more modern and only slightly more sophisticated way of calculating service area. And this time it's from a company named Conveil. We have no more circles, but here instead we see blobs of service that don't really extend into the water. It seems more organic. It uses the road-based methods to identify reach. But again, it only assumes that any built road would accommodate any pedestrian, and that too is problematic. And so lastly, we want to look at collecting data at scale that really specifically depicts what the built environment has and what is the pedestrian transportation network. And through that, we're able to model and calculate not just pedestrian reach, but the true personalized pedestrian network analysis. We can model and simulate the mobility and traversability of different types of pedestrians given their personal mobility requirements, their wants, their likes, and their dislikes. And I argue that we are computationally savvy enough by now that this should not seem as like a huge hurdle, but we find a lot of pushback from a lot of the existing infrastructure and organizations. And so that's really a lot of where the cultural and social norms have to be questioned. But specifically to the technology we're building out, once these data exist, we really can ask the detailed questions about pedestrian access. And rather than provide these as the crow flies types of analysis, we can specifically say that in this case, we're showing a manual wheelchair user. This is the area they're able to traverse with this particular starting point. And we have cost functions that are able to express this in the built environment so that instead of having a person evaluate every piece of the pedestrian network to identify what is right for them, we're able to do that computationally and then simulate the real world experience of that pedestrian with those needs, creating this kind of personalized experiential understanding of our spaces. So we see that some of this network here that was previously implied that this person would be able to reach it is now inaccessible to that person because of their personalized mobility profile and needs about the environment. So I hope this kind of broadly expresses like what it is that we're trying to do in terms of collecting both the data and creating the models and simulation capabilities to truly personalize the routing experience of people through the environment. And so describing again what it is that we do, we talk to people, we try to understand their challenges about the environment. For example, people who have conveyed that the sidewalk width change is something they want to know about in advance, or that there is a tactile guide on the right, or that the particular incline at this street is 12%. Or, you know, what's happening with crossing, and is there a construction here, and where is the bulb, where is the crossing bulb start and end? So all of these questions are questions that came from the community, but are things that we are able to collect in a detailed, neutral, non-subjective way at scale, and then use that in order to evaluate the real traversability in the environment for people, and identify like where can they independently travel with low or no assistance. So what I'd like to demo now, and hoping that all the components internet inclusive works, what you see now on the screen, I hope, is Access Map incremental, and this is our alpha of the next generation. It opens up in Seattle, but we actually have multiple other service areas, including Quito, Santiago, Bellevue, etc. And so rather than searching for a specific address, I will just demonstrate. So for those who might actually be familiar with Seattle, this is at sea level because we are on the Puget Sound. And very rapidly, there's an incline up to First Hill. So traversing these streets is actually quite challenging in this particular direction because of the topography of our city, and it's quite hilly here. So what you can see, for instance, I will click on a particular sidewalk and I should get an information that the street name is on Madison. This is the north sidewalk of Madison Street. It has an 11.2% incline. Its surface is concrete, and we have some street IDs here to be able to look at that. On the left is that personalization card. So we do offer some canonical ideas of like what different mobility device users might use, but really we try to drive the idea that your mobility is your personal mobility. And so you can choose to either avoid streets altogether. So this means that you will route only where sidewalk infrastructure exists, which might be really limiting in certain parts of our city where that infrastructure doesn't exist. So if you say, I want to fully avoid streets, that means that if there is no route between your start and destination that has sidewalks, you won't be served a route. But then you can choose to relax that constraint. But at least starting out, I want to avoid walking in the middle of a street. I want to just use sidewalks. Today, let's say I'm feeling a little bit, less strong. So perhaps my uphill steepness maximum is at 7.5. And then let's say the downhill steepness, I'm willing to take a little bit more, but still like, let's go to 9.5. And so assuming, let's say that I landed down here, I'm gonna route from here because I just went to the Great Wheel, which has an accessible wheelchair seat. So, and let's assume that I want to take the train from Westlake Station. So I'm gonna route to here. And so as you can see, I didn't get the shortest Google path. I got a route that is potentially longer, but it does work out with my particular scenario and particular constraints that I've applied here. And what I want to know is, okay, what is going to be my experiential elevation gain? I also want to potentially get cards for voiceover reading that will give me step-by-step instructions of exactly what I need to do, which side of the sidewalk should I walk on, and what streets am I crossing, etc. And so we find that users are really amenable to this kind of instruction set when they require that level of detail, and many of them do. So, and I will say that like one of our biggest user base for Access Map has always been people pushing strollers, not necessarily people that we had anticipated using this work, but we're really happy that everyone gets to benefit from the kind of work that we're doing. Now, the next thing that I want to demonstrate, and then I'll end with that is that we're recently just incorporated also information for indoor transit stations. So I won't be talking about that work today, but that's really kind of our next step in working with communities to identify the information needed to do traversals that are multimodal. So start me out on the street environment. Let's route from here. But now it's going to give me, okay, so this is the routing on the street itself to the original destination that we described. But let's say I'm going much further to another location. And let me find the area of, here we go. So I went much further here, but I'm attempting to use the rail. And the idea here is that I want to get to the mall and be able to independently travel there. So that requires multimodal information about not just the sidewalks, but eventually I'm going to enter the station and have cards that tell me specifically what to do, take which elevator, use which railway, take that railway, and then continue up to the next station where you're dropped off, and then popping back up to the street, exiting the station and turning left, etc. And so that level of detail and the ability to actually have the routing capabilities that are going much further than just telling you to take public transport, but alleviating some of the complexity and confusion that ends up happening inside transit stations, and the ability to actually work through a multi-level station, say in this particular case, requiring elevators and not steps. Okay, going back to our discussion. So this lands us in the last part of my conversation, which is that with this data, we can also, in addition to traveler-facing tools that simplify mobility, increase independence, and reach to community services and community living, we can also begin to offer what is intended to serve planners, as well as city planners and transportation planners, that offer more specific traversal models that allows them to really assess the gaps that exist in accessibility in a city, and also be able to evaluate how well are we doing as we follow through and, follow through our transition plans, make improvements to our built environment. So the work that I'm describing here is part of the Transportation Data Equity Initiative. And essentially our roadmap has been to work with communities to create data specifications. So you saw the work I described for open sidewalks. You saw the end piece of what we have been doing with GTFS pathways to describe transit station information. And the focus is on historically travel disadvantaged communities and gathering that information on what should be the data specification. And the next step is to provide scalable data tools and services, one of which is Access Map Multimodal, but now let's show that we can also measurably deploy these planning tools that allow planners to make that transition into the modern, inclusive ideals from, the cities they inherited that are sort of inherently unequal and underserving some populations. And what I wanted to know, even before we get into tools, is that disrupting the current norms, as we talked about before, really relies on people also changing their mindset, right? Like as we round out this part of the conversation, we want to show that having this kind of information may serve travelers. It will build capacity for being able to measure inequities and evaluate how well we're doing. But without changing the mindset of planners, we're not going to get very far, right? There's a lot of institutional, political, and cultural hurdles that disallow this kind of progression. And so part of what we've been doing is working with urban planners to develop a disability justice for urban planners tools. It's essentially a card set that allows and promotes having these conversations internally, educating people about the social and structural barriers that people with disabilities experience in the cities. And my argument is that we have to couple those different tools, not just data tools, but with these culturally changing tools in order to make the change real, and really advance the cause of equitable cities. So I can go into a discussion. I'm not 100% sure how long you wanted to leave for questions and answers, but I can just give a short discussion of what our dashboards for planners include. The one that I'm showing right now is a dashboard for evaluating per sidewalk accessibility according to different stereotype pedestrian profiles. So in this example, we're looking at a normative walking profile. So that's like a normative Google individual, which assumes that no specific features are barriers and maximum pedestrian movement speed. And so what the map is showing is which downtown Seattle sidewalks are presumably accessible to this type of mobility profile, and compare that now with what it looks like for a manual wheelchair. So we black out those sidewalks that are potentially inaccessible to what we have found to be an average manual wheelchair. And I wanted to highlight again that we use these canonical averages of our users that have indicated to us that they use these particular devices and what their preferences are. But I really discourage people from just creating a manual wheelchair user at large. It's just for demonstration purposes. We really do hope for people to, especially when looking at personal mobility, to clue in their specific detailed preferences and needs about the environment. So here we see what is accessible to this normative, to this typical manual wheelchair. And we see that a lot of streets have been blacked out. As I said before, a lot of this is topography based, but not all of it. Some of these are barriers because of lack of curb ramps or other features in the environment that the manual wheelchair user may need. And so now compare that to in addition, creating like the 6-foot width requirement, which is sort of a comfortable space. We did this when there was social distancing concerns, but the truth of the matter is that 6-foot sidewalks are really a much more comfortable space for someone using a wheelchair, because there's enough space for someone else, either in opposing direction or in the same direction, to be walking side by side. So now you see that even with those blacked out experiences, the ones that have been purpled out are those that would be typically accessible to someone with a manual wheelchair, but does not fit within that 6-foot width difference. And really what we're trying to show is that once we have this kind of objective, detailed data about the environment, we can analyze and understand so much more about our city and what the infrastructure provides using very simple filtering tools, right? At this point, I'm not simulating or modeling anything. There's no very difficult computations that went into this particular dashboard. It's really about filtering on the information that we have. So the next thing we want to be able to ask is, where are accessibility islands in the city of Seattle? How are the disconnections there? And so what the map is essentially showing, so here we are actually modeling a specific individual. Again, in this case, we're using that modeled manual wheelchair user to ask, what is connected for this user, and where are there places that are completely island or disconnected from the rest of the network? And what we see is that on the whole, the city of Seattle has 2 main networks. So they're shown in light gray and dark gray. And those are connected parts of the network. And then there are 165 little islands that are not accessible from outside that island, basically. And it means that if you end up doing business in this area of town, then you may have no recourse of getting anywhere and have to be picked up directly from there, because you can't even access the fixed bus route. Even if it may be 2 blocks away, if there's no way to get off the island, there's no way for you to connect to the rest of the city from there. And so these are really tools that enable planners to prioritize where to put new infrastructure that may remove some of these discontinuities or disconnectivities in the network. And then finally, the ability to do something like a walk score, but actually true access for non-motorized transportation score, because for each sidewalk, we are able to show that even though, so the typical walk score, for those of you familiar with it, really scores an area of town based on the amenities that are reachable to us from there. But reachability, again, uses just the road network, not really taking into account the true infrastructure for pedestrians. So here we show some areas where that disparity exists, where in the background we see green, which is what walk score tells us here. And at the same time, this particular block face has a pretty poor score when it comes to what we call the sidewalk score, which looks into how is the infrastructure actually supporting pedestrians? Are there sidewalks here? Is the incline likely to be traversable? Are there curb ramps here, et cetera, et cetera? So you see that some of these disparities are there, and this gives us a much better view of how infrastructure impacts mobility in this environment, even though, you may have several grocery stores and financial institutions that are within reach here based on just their radial location. So this pretty much sums up our work with open sidewalks. And the idea is to have cities designed for the fullness of human experience. Our research and analysis has shown that while many projects are well-intentioned and advance the ideas of, inclusivity in cities, we have to take specifically the experience of people and people with disabilities, and not just subject it to some monolithic idea of who they are, but take a real, intentional, neutral approach to the experience of people experiencing the environment and tune our methods to them. So our vision for smarter cities is included in our work with USDOT ITS for Us program, which we have called the Transportation Data Equity Analysis. We extend both design, data collection, and data formats so that travelers as well as city planners have the tool to access community-supported, complete information that is really truly reflective of the lived experience of people in those communities. And we couple these three pillars that I've talked about today: participatory design principles to expand and ratify versioned releases of data formats that are responsive to real community needs, presenting community with data formats for review and acceptance, and a competitive process for community grants to vet and assist with data collection, and then the data collection tools and methodologies that allow communities to participate and steward that data collection. And then finally, demonstration projects that are tested in real communities to test the broader impact and demonstrable use of these data formats and how they might scale to various geographies and different populations. And so with that, I will thank again my hosts. I'm really honored and excited that I was given the opportunity to speak to you today. And of course, if you wish to join the fun, you can always find us at UW-TCAT, which stands for University of Washington Taskar Center for Accessible Technology at uw.edu. And as I mentioned, we are taking applications from communities as well as community leaders to bring some of this work to your community. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Caspi. That was a fantastic and so interesting and informative. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up to any questions that the audience may have. And I have one question here from Tom Bugglesong. And the question is, how about those that are sight impaired? Does your app have voice I \O? I don't know what that is, but
yes, thank you, Tom, for that question. So part of what I demonstrated was the voiceover reader cards, which are the step-by-step instructions that just come directly through the Access Map multimodal interface. So that's part one of my answer. Part two is that as part of our ITS for US work, we have partnered with XR Navigation, which has as one of its products called Audium. Audium takes our data, the Open Sidewalks data that I talked about, and provides a sort of prospective voice interface to the map. So that provides not a routing-based exploration, but specifically the ability to explore the whole map and all those attributes that I talked about via a voice interface specifically. So you get to kind of navigate that map however you want without specific routing considerations, and just explore, like, what is there? What will I find here? What, businesses are in and around this area? In addition to that, it has information about landmarks in that area, tactile paving, landmarks that can include light poles and trees, as well as manhole covers. And we're very much interested in people trying this out when our alpha launches in this January. So if you're interested, please get in touch, because we are looking forward to launch.
Great, thank you very much. Our next question is from Professor Vinod Naborduri in our College of Health. He says, great presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering, how do you handle the scalability challenge with Access Map? Is there use of crowdsourcing, or is all data gathered and processed by the urban planner? Also, wondering if you have thought about how some of this work can be taken to less urban environments.
Yeah, a great question. So it's kind of a three-part question. So first, the scalability with Access Map is specifically addressed by having a data standard in open sidewalks, right? Because as I showed, we're already covering like 7 cities because we have data in the same standard there. So anything that conforms to the standard can be consumed there. So for example, right now, Corfu, Greece happens to have an interested community that wants to produce that data. So they're going to work on creating that data. And as soon as the data is in, we can launch an access map for them. So that really was the thing that instigated the ideation of open sidewalks. We actually started out with building access map locally and figured out that, wow, if we want to do this for every city, it's going to be impossible to take the inputs from each city and how fragmented it was and how different cities collected data in such different ways or didn't even have any data collections. So that didn't seem scalable. And it was really clear that a data schema that was consistent and standardized was the need. So that's part one. Part two, is there any use of crowdsourcing? We have built a number, I would say 4 broadly construed different tooling for collecting this data. One is a crowdsourcing approach. 2 is a street level based approach, which includes a hardware and software solution. So we have, an off the shelf components technology that you can recompose on your own. You can grab our software and be able to deploy it. It's still more costly than we would like because it does require the use of a 3D camera. So altogether, building that out on your own would cost about $800, but it's very detailed. And that is what, for example, our partners at King County Access, which is a paratransit service for King County, are using to do the assessments of access to paratransit in some locations. And they have partnered with us on this. The third mode of use is the one that is most scalable, and is the one that we're currently pursuing with the Washington State proviso that we got to do sidewalk collection for all of Washington State. And that is starting with aerial satellite imagery and making predictions. So that's where we use our AI and machine learning based methods to make the initial predictions of where sidewalk infrastructure is and what is there. And then people can vet it either on location or through street level imagery and make bigger and better assessments. It does put together the satellite imagery along with digital elevation models. So we are able to make fairly accurate assessments of the inclines, but width, for example, is an approximate estimation, and other things that we would typically want to collect, like accessible pedestrian service signals, are completely inaccessible via the computer vision approaches. So you can see that as you get more scale up, you get more data, and but of course there's less detail that's available there. And then the last approach is an app-based approach, so allowing people to just walk around the environment. And again, it does a computer vision assessment of what's there and then sends the information to the cloud without the imagery. So you're not compromising privacy and security, but you're able to just pass on the mapping data back to the cloud. I hope that answers the question. Let me see. thoughts about some of this work to less urban environments. That's right. So we have now experienced, as I think I mentioned earlier, we are working in all of Washington state, very little of which is actually super urban. We have a lot of rural communities in Washington state, and we're also working in 2 counties in Oregon, one of which is completely rural. We're in Columbia and Multnomah counties, as well as in Maryland, Harford, and Baltimore County, which do not actually include Baltimore. So those 2 are non-urban and suburban environments. And so we have been very active there. It certainly brought up more nuanced information that we needed to collect. For example, we are now collecting verges, and what is the non-sidewalk infrastructure like? Is there a painted shoulder here? Is there any measurable paving that we can identify for people? Because many people whose experience is rural have no choice but to traverse those non-infrastructure environments, but they want to know better, like, what to expect there, right? Am I going to be in a ditch, or is there an actual shoulder here where I can potentially, travel? So that I think answers all the parts of the question.
Great, thank you so much. Next question is from Kofi Adutwam, wondering how this can be translated into other environments. For example, how can we use similar design principles to make play space accessible for kids with disabilities?
Awesome question. That's actually where we started. So that's a whole other talk about our universal play kiosk and the work that we've done there. I wish we had time today. Maybe you can talk to me for further conversation. But yes, I totally agree that these are just very generic design principles. I just want to give people a real palpable sense of how we have employed this in real work, and that it's actually being used on the ground by real people.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Kate Brown. Hi, thank you for your presentation. Have you used the data collected to create access map to provide suggestions for the city on how to increase accessibility? That's the first question. Second is, I have a lot of past knowledge about accessibility in New York City, and I know that they have been attempting to create a map to see what public transportation is accessible. Is this a future step for your platform?
It's a current step. So we have a collaboration with Meta, as well as the US DOT, and there is a community of mappers on the ground in New York City that are actively collecting this data for all of Manhattan and a little bit of Queens at this point. And in fact, I think maybe I'm not 100% accurate, so maybe I shouldn't misspeak, but Meta is organizing another online mapathon in the next couple of weeks for New York City and Washington, D.C. And we're participating.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Please feel free to, we have a few more minutes. Feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A. Right.
And please do get in touch if you're interested in engaging in any of this work.
Yes. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation, very, very interesting. And thank you all participants for joining us today. And I'd like to remind everyone about, just before we conclude, just a quick reminder that our next disability independence presentation will be on global disability innovation by Professor Kathy Holloway, Professor of Interaction, Design and Innovation at University College London. And that'll be on October 31st, 12 p.m. And we'll be providing some some advertising about that. And I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Capri, for joining us today and for taking your time. Very much enjoyed your presentation, learned a lot. And thank to everyone for joining us for this for our first series on disability independence colloquium. This will be posted online on our YouTube channel. And we just thank you for all. And if there's any further questions, as Dr. Capri said, to please connect with her. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.